Whitby Conservatory, the grey interface that was pleasant but unremarkable. She wore a dark coat and carried a leather handbag, and she walked with the careful confidence of someone who was used to being in control. "Mr. Brennan," she said, "thank you for coming." "Who are you?" Thomas asked. "How do you know about that night?" "My name is Margaret," the woman said. "And as for how I know, that is not important. What is important is what I want." She led him to a small coffee shop on Commonwealth Avenue, and they sat in Elsa's, and then, last year, she had been diagnosed with cancer. The doctors had given her a year to live, and suddenly, the fear came back, sharper than before, because she knew she was running out of time to set things right. "I need to see Michael and Christine," Diana said. "I need to tell them the truth, and then I need to tell the police." "You can't go to the police," Thomas said. "You'll go to prison. You'll die in prison." Diana smiled, a sad and tired smile. "Maybe," she said, "but at least, why wouldn't buildings that housed a general store, a pharmacy, a diner, and a few other businesses? There was a church with a white steeple and a town hall with a flag out front. It was the kind of town that existed in memory and nostalgia, untouched by the modernity that had transformed so much of America." Marcus checked into the Evergreen Inn, a small hotel on the edge of town, and spent the rest of the afternoon walking the streets, getting a feel for the place. People looked at him with, "Come to Evergreen because Dorothy Parker's nephew had a cottage there, and because it was the last place on earth anyone would think to look for a New York socialite." But Richard Bellamy had found her anyway, and he had taken her back. Marcus went to see Captain Hartley at the NYPD. He told him everything, about Eleanor, about the cottage, about the man who had taken Sarah. Hartley listened carefully, and when Marcus finished, he looked troubled. "I know Richard Bellamy," Hartley said. It was. Richard Bellamy had realized, at the last moment, that killing his wife was too risky. He had staged her rescue, hoping that her survival would make him look like a victim rather than a perpetrator. It was a gamble, and it had failed. Chapter 8, The Trial. Richard Bellamy was arrested 2 days later. The documents Sarah had taken with her were turned over to the police, and they were enough to sink his empire. The city official he had bribed was also arrested. The FBI opened "We're a detective with the police department there." That was not quite true. Eli was a private investigator, not a police detective. He worked for a small agency in Boston that handled mostly divorce cases and insurance fraud investigations. It was not the most glamorous of careers, but it paid the bills and it kept him busy, which was all he asked. "Did he now?" Eli said. "Oh yes," the station master said. "Spent half an hour telling me about you, how you'd solved all sorts of difficult cases, how had been through his things, papers were scattered. A locked drawer in his desk had been forced open. Whatever he had found, it seems someone else found it first." Chapter 3, The Investigation. Eli spent the rest of the day dealing with the practical matters of death. He identified his father's body at the funeral home, a grim and necessary task that he enjoyed with the detached professionalism of someone who had seen too many dead bodies in his line of work. Martha Vance looked smaller in death. She had memorized long ago. My sister Eliza was the oldest of us 3 girls. She was 23 years old in the summer of 1894. She was beautiful and spirited, and she had a passion for the sea. She used to walk down to the lighthouse every evening to watch the keeper light the lamp. She said the light made her feel like she was part of something larger, something infinite. She met the lighthouse keeper, a man named Thomas Whitmore. He was a widower, about 40 years old, with a young. "Surprise, tear down the lighthouse. You can't be serious." "I'm not saying we actually tear it down," Eli said. "But we can do something that's just as powerful. We can tell the truth. We can publish everything. The letter, the photographs, the newspaper articles. We can make sure that everyone knows what Thomas Whitmore did, even if he can no longer be punished for it." The sheriff thought about this. "And your father, what he was trying to do?" "My father was a difficult man," Eli said. "He was cold, lost several fortunes over the years, and he had a reputation for being charming and unreliable. He had married Evelyn 30 years ago, when she was a wealthy widow, and he was a man on his way up. The marriage had been unhappy, by all accounts, but they had stayed together for reasons that had to do with money and pride and the comfort of habit. Evelyn Crane had a nephew named Robert, who had been her favorite for many years. Robert had expected to inherit her fortune when she died. Instead, he, Joseph Crane, charging him with the murder of his wife. Crane was arrested at the Grand Hotel on the morning of March 12. He did not resist. He did not protest his innocence. He simply looked at the police officers with the same weary expression he had shown Riley and said, "I wondered when you would figure it out." The trial was a sensation. Every newspaper in Boston covered it. Every television station broadcast it. Joseph Crane, in his expensive suit and his careful manner, looked like
fixtures, every scratch in the wooden floor of the lobby. He knew the quirks of the old projector and the way the screen rippled when the air conditioning was on too high, and the secret room behind the concession stood where Henry stored the extra film reels. He loved this theater in a way that his father did not understand, could not understand. To Henry, the Ritz was a business, a way to make a living. To Michael, it was home. "Dad, please," Michael said, "give me another year. I know I can." The Ritz was demolished in 2015 after a final screening of a classic film to a crowd of 1,000 people who had come from all over the country. The last reel ended at midnight, and when the lights came up, everyone was crying. But the theater was not really gone. It lived on in the memories of everyone who had ever sat in its seats, everyone who had ever fallen in love in its balcony, everyone who had ever dreamed dreams in its darkness. It lived on in the shrunken by age and illness, but his eyes were still sharp. Why? Michael asked. "Because it was my bridge," Martin said. "I built it. I poured the concrete and strung the cables and bolted the steel. And then, over the years, I watched as the city neglected it. I watched as they cut maintenance budgets and ignored repairs. I watched as the bridge I had built started to fall apart. So you decided to bring it down. No." Martin shook his head slowly. "I decided to save it. The only way to force the..."
It's beautiful prose, but it was also controversial, because many of the plants Clara had described were nowhere to be found. Elizabeth traveled the world, searching for them. She found some in botanical gardens, carefully preserved and labeled as specimens of unknown origin. She found others in the private collections of plant enthusiasts who had acquired them decades ago and had no idea where they had come from. But some of the plants were gone forever. They had been hybrids, crosses between. 15 years in federal prison, Robert Vance, who had cooperated with the prosecution, received a sentence of 5 years. He served 3. Chapter 5, The Diamonds. The diamonds were never found. Frank searched for them for years, long after his retirement. He tracked Marino's associates and his travels and his financial records. He followed leads all over the world, to Switzerland and Dubai and Hong Kong and back again. He found nothing. The diamonds had vanished, as if they had never refused. By the end, she was spending most of her time in the house, alone with the dead, trying to do what they asked while trying to maintain some grip on the living world. Mary found a letter at the back of the diary. It was addressed to her, written in Catherine's shaky hand. "Dear Mary, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have come to the house on the hill. I know that your mother kept you away from me, and I understand. I was not the grandmother she wanted me to be. I was
in California, but there was also an envelope that was not like the others. It was addressed to Clara Whitman, and it was hand-delivered, because there was no postmark. Clara opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on it were written the following words. Dear Mrs. Whitman, I am writing to you from the Whitby Conservatory of Music in Vermont. We are seeking a piano teacher for the fall semester, and your name was given to us by a former colleague who spoke highly of you. We'll work toward, Clara said, and that's what we'll achieve. Chapter 5, The Concert. By September, Lily had changed. Her playing was still raw, still imperfect, but there was a control to it now, a sense of purpose. She was learning to channel her emotions into her music instead of letting them consume her. Clara had not uncovered her own piano at home, but she found herself thinking about it more and more. She would sit in her living room and remember the pieces she used to play, the sunbathing and drinking beer, and their nights around the campfire, telling stories and laughing at things that were only funny because they were young. Diana had been the most beautiful girl Thomas had ever seen. She had long blonde hair and blue eyes and a laugh that sounded like music. She had a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only person in the world, and Thomas had fallen desperately in love with her, even though he knew she was out of his league, even though Margaret had given him a small white farmhouse at the end of a dirt road. He parked his car and walked up to the front door. Diana opened the door. She was older now, her face lined and her hair gray, but her eyes were the same blue they had been 30 years ago. When she saw Thomas, she went pale. I knew you'd come, she said. I knew it was only a matter of time. Chapter 6, The Truth. They sat in Diana's kitchen, drinking tea, and she told him everything. She had run away that night. She, 14, no body, no ransom demand, no indication of foul play. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Marcus looked at the photographs. Sarah Bellamy was an attractive woman, with dark hair and dark eyes and a smile that seemed to light up the photographs. Her children were a boy and a girl, both with her dark coloring. What do you think happened to her? I don't know, Eleanor said, but I believe she is alive. And I believe she went to Evergreen by her own choice. What I need you to. Connected man, he has friends in the police department, in the DA's office, in City Hall. If he killed his wife, there's no way we're going to prove it, not without more evidence. Then give me more time, Marcus said. We'll find something. Hartley looked at him for a long moment. You're putting yourself in danger, he said. If Bellamy finds out you're investigating him, he could have you killed. It wouldn't be the first time something like that happened in this city. I know the risks, Marcus. About a year after the trial, he found her on the beach, watching her children play in the sand. I got a letter from Eleanor, Sarah said, without turning to look at him. She wanted to thank you for everything you did. She said she had never believed her friend was really gone. Who was Eleanor? Marcus asked. Really? Sarah smiled, a small, private smile. She was a friend of my mother's. They had known each other since they were girls. When my mother died, Eleanor promised she would look after. Smelled of coffee and old paper. The woman at the front desk looked up at him with tired eyes. Can I help you? I'm Eli Vance, he said. My father was Arthur Vance. The sheriff wrote to me about his death. The woman's expression softened. Well, Mr. Vance, I'm so sorry. The sheriff is expecting you. Please, go on in. She pointed to a door at the back of the room. Eli walked through it and found himself in a small office, cluttered with filing cabinets and cardboard boxes. A man sat behind a desk. Profoundly lonely, the main room was dominated by a large window that looked out over the sea. There was a kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom, and a small study filled with books about maritime history. The walls were lined with photographs of ships and lighthouses, and with maps of the coast that had been drawn and redrawn over the years. The workshop was at the back of the lighthouse, in a separate building that was connected to the main structure by a covered walkway. It was a cluttered space. Son, Eliza fell in love with him, and for a while it seemed like they might be married. But then something happened. I never knew exactly what. Eliza became secretive, and she stopped going to the lighthouse. A few weeks later, she was dead. What do you think happened to her? Mr. Spill's eyes were bright with orange tears. I think Thomas Whitmore killed her. I think he murdered my sister and made it look like an accident. And I think the reason he got away with it is that everyone in this town, empty in a cold spring evening, then he sat down on the bed and poured himself a drink from the bottle he had brought with him. And he waited. Chapter 2. The Housekeeper. The housekeeper was a woman named Margaret O'Brien, aged 62, who had worked at the Grand Hotel for 30 years. She had seen everything in her time at the hotel, the rich and the famous, the powerful and the corrupt, the lavish and the thieves. She had developed a sixth sense about guests, an ability to know who, once, Riley said, "You checked into our hotel. You didn't even wait for the funeral." Quinn looked at Riley with red-rimmed eyes. "Because I couldn't stand to be there," he said. The house was full of her. Her smell, her voice, her presence. I couldn't breathe. I had to get away. Riley believed him, or at least, he wanted to believe him. But there was still the question of the nephew's accusation. Someone had made that accusation, and accusations did not come from nowhere. Chapter 4. The Autopsy. Riley. For about an hour, then he had come back downstairs, without the Bob, and had asked her to call him a cab. He had been gone for about 3 hours. When he came back, he was pale and shaking. He had gone straight to his room and had not come out until the next morning. Margaret had not thought anything of it at the time. But now, with what she knew about Crane's arrest, she understood. He had left the hotel that night. He had gone somewhere. He had done something, and he had come back.
Was threadbare, and the screen showed first-run movies 3 weeks after they had opened in the cities. People went to the drive-in now, or they stayed home and watched television. Henry Marsh had owned the Ritz for 30 years. He had started as a popcorn boy when he was 12, and he had worked his way up to owner by the time he was 30. He had seen the theater through the golden age of movies and the rise of television, and the arrival of multiplexes that showed 12 movies at once. Want to save it, but I can't do it alone. I need your help. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, from the darkness at the back of the theater, a voice answered. Chapter 5. The Voice. The voice belonged to a woman. She told Michael her name was Dorothy, and she had been the manager of the Ritz in the 1940s. She had loved this theater more than anything in the world, and when she died, in 1948, she had not wanted to leave. She had stayed, watching over the theater, protecting it from It did, those two would have failed within the month. You saved thousands of lives, the FBI director told Michael. If that cable had snapped during rush hour, there would have been hundreds of deaths. But Michael did not feel like a hero. He felt like someone who had looked into the abyss and had barely pulled back in time. Chapter 3. The Suspect. 3 months after the sabotage was discovered, the FBI arrested a man named Harold Dunn. He was 58 years old, a former employee of the
Life in a greenhouse experimenting with plants. When she showed interest in botany as a young woman, her family had laughed at her. When she tried to publish her research as a middle-aged woman, she had been rejected by every academic journal. So she had stopped trying. She had continued her work in secret, and she had left it. When she died, to the house and the garden and the greenhouse that no one had sought to look for. Elizabeth understood. She had faced similar obstacles in her own. Trial lasted 3 weeks. Marino's lawyer argued that Vance was a liar and a thief who had fabricated the entire story to get a reduced sentence for his own crimes. The lawyer presented Marino as a respectable businessman who had been framed by a desperate man with a history of financial problems. But the jury did not believe it. After 3 days of deliberation, they found Marino guilty of interstate transportation of stolen property and conspiracy to commit robbery. The judge sentenced him to room Merrifield prisons, a sense that the house was not quite empty. Your grandmother was not like other people. Margaret said finally. She had her own ways, her own beliefs. She believed that the dead could communicate with the living, if you knew how to listen. Mary felt a chill run down her spine. Did she claim to speak to spirits? Margaret smiled, a thin, sad smile. She claimed a lot of things. Whether you believed them or not was up to you. Chapter 4. The Diary. That night, Mary.
He was alone. The sheriff had agreed to his plan. The letter and the photographs would be published in the Harbor Haven Herald, along with a full account of Eliza Bell's death and the 60-year cover-up that had followed. The story would be picked up by the newspapers in Portland and Boston. Thomas Whitmore's legacy would be destroyed, and the truth would finally be known. It was not justice, exactly. Justice would have been a trial and a conviction, but it was something, it was.
The Broken Window. Chapter 1. The Crime. The window of the jewelry store on Madison Avenue was smashed at 2:13 in the morning on the night of December 23, 1978. The silent alarm was triggered, and the police arrived within minutes. But by the time they got there, the thief was gone, and so was the merchandise, 47 diamonds, valued at a total of $2.3 million. Detective Frank Sullivan of the NEPT was assigned to the case. He was 56 years old, 2 years from retirement, and had kept it all those years, the only reminder of the case that had obsessed him for 2 decades. And now, finally, he could rest. The end. O'Connor had been a wealthy woman, Margaret explained. She had inherited the house and the land from her husband, who had died in 1955. She had lived alone ever since, tending her garden and reading her books and receiving visitors who came to the house on the hill and never quite seemed to leave. Visitors? Mary asked. Margaret did not answer directly. She led Mary through the house, showing her the rooms, the furniture, the collections of china and silver and old photographs. And in each,
people came from all over the state. People who had grown up watching movies at the Ritz and had moved away and had come back for this one night. They sat in the velvet seats and watched a classic film on the newly restored screen. And when the lights came up at the end, everyone was crying. Michael stood in the lobby, shaking hands with the guests, and he felt a presence beside him. He turned and saw, for just a moment, a woman in Anne. Michael would arrive in the morning and find the theater doors unlocked, even though he had locked them the night before. He would hear footsteps in the auditorium when he was alone, and laughter from the balcony, and the sound of popcorn being popped in the concession stand. At first, he was frightened, but gradually, as the hauntings continued without causing any harm, he began to feel something else: curiosity, and eventually, acceptance. The theater was not haunted by something. Charles River, connecting Boston to Cambridge. It was a beautiful structure built in 1930 with twin towers of steel and a road suspended by thick cables. It was considered one of the engineering marvels of its era, and it carried 50,000 cars a day. But now, one of the main cables had snapped. It had happened at 3 in the morning, when traffic was lit, and no one had been killed. But the bridge was closed, and there were engineers and police and politicians everywhere, all of them.
With the World. Chapter 3. The Discovery. Elizabeth found the greenhouse on her 3rd week in the house. It was behind the garden, half hidden by a stand of old oak trees, and it had been locked. But the lock was old and rusted, and Elizabeth was able to force it open with a crowbar. Inside the greenhouse, she found the truth. The greenhouse was full of plants, hundreds of them, more beautiful and more bizarre than anything she had ever seen. There were flowers with petals that changed color. He had no record, no history, no connection to any of the crimes he had committed. He was a ghost, a professional who came in, did the job, and disappeared. But Frank was better. He flew to Miami and found Marino. He watched him for 3 days, learning his routines, his habits, his weaknesses. And on the 4th day, he made the arrest. Marino did not resist. He looked at Frank with cold, calculating eyes, and he said, "You're good, but you're too late. The diamonds are all ready." Same stubborn jaw. Did you know her well? Margaret was quiet. "I knew her well enough," she said finally. "Come inside. There's a lot I need to tell you." Chapter 3. The house. The inside of the house was as impressive as the outside. There were high ceilings and wide hallways, rooms full of antique furniture and old paintings. Everything was covered with dust, as if no one had cleaned in months. But the bones of the house were solid, and Mary could see that it had been beautiful once. "Catherine," Vance said, "a lot of money. I had debts, gambling debts, more than I could pay. And I knew that the only way to get out was to take it from someone who had more than they needed. But you didn't do the robbery yourself. No. Vance shook his head. "I'm an architect, not a thief. I don't have the skills for that kind of work. What I did was provide the information. I told someone else how to get in, and I gave them the access codes they needed. And in exchange, they gave me a cut." "Who was